Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Léonce Byimana. I'm the Executive Director of the TASSC International. That's a Torture, Abolition, and Survivor Support Coalition International. We are an organization helping torture survivors from around the world. We are based in Washington, D.C. So together with other organizations, we have thought it would be a great idea to organize this event to talk about what is happening in Libya for Libyan citizens, but also for immigrants who are trapped in Libya. And we want to make sure that everyone who is concerned about Libya has an opportunity to hear what we have to say, but also to intervene, to give more ideas, but also to help to the call for action. So this is a good opportunity for me to thank Andrea Gagne, to thank Michael Teklit, Phillipe Nassif, and Hassan Morajea. I also want to thank Nia Kwete, Megan Doherty, Aldibi Melad, and Andrea Byron for their help in putting together this panel discussion. So we have now almost 30 people who are attending. We're expecting around 100 people. So I give my greetings to everyone who took their time and came to this platform to this panel discussion. We have a Facebook live going on right now. I'm sharing the link to the chat room. In the audience, we're going to have people from the US Senate, US Congress. We have people from the State Department. We have people from the European Union. We have individuals from the UN, UNHCR in particular, WFP, and other organizations involved in work in Libya, but also individuals who are worried about what is happening, who want to see Libya situation change. So I will let panelists introduce themselves. And also, they're going to talk 10 minutes each. And if you have a question, please write your question in the chat room. Also, if you want to speak, please write to me in the chat room. I'm going to allow you to speak, but that's eventually after the presentations. And at the end of the presentation, Phillipe from Amnesty is going to share with us the call for action, and I'm going to share a link where you can leave your email and your organization, and we're going to follow up with you on the next steps in the action we're going to take on security and peace in Libya. So thank you so much. Maybe I will let Andrea start present herself. Andrea. Yeah.
There we go. Hi, thank you so much, Léonce. It's a pleasure to be here. Just a brief introduction?
Yes, just 1 minute. Yeah.
Thank you. So I am an independent activist. I do also work in a refugee agency, but my Libya activism is based fully independently. And I've been documenting the experiences of refugees in Libya all across the country in different detention centers and using that information to advocate.
Thank you, Andrea, for sharing. Michael?
My name is Mikhail, and I'm Eritrean. I have been in US for the last 2 years. I'm also part of Refugee Congress in the US and represent Maryland. I'm also aware of refugees in North Africa for the last 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Phillipe, you want to?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Phillipe Nassif, and I am the Advocacy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International USA, based in Washington, D.C. So I handle all of our advocacy work for the MENA region. Libya is practically front and center of a lot of the work that I've been doing with the United States government since I've been in this role, and I look forward to talking more about some of our findings on Libya, and then talking about some opportunities to help Libya out via legislation in the United States Congress.
Thank you so much, Phillipe. Hey, Hassan.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Hassan Morajea. I'm a researcher and analyst, and I work with Mercy Corps Libya. We run an analysis unit that is trying to support international aid efforts in Libya by helping inform their efforts through context analysis.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you for sharing. So we, as I mentioned before, we're going to start with Hassan. Hassan, if your internet is not good in Tunisia, you can turn off the video. But if your internet is good, you can leave the video. So Hassan is going to start our conversation. So go ahead, Hassan.
Yeah, I think I might turn off the video just because it got a little bit choppy there when I was talking. So I will just turn the video off and then I'll start it. Okay. So I wanted to begin today just by giving a bit of an overview of the dynamics that the Libyan conflict has kind of been governed by over the past, well, almost 10 years now. So Libya is currently divided between multiple warring factions. The dynamics that govern this divide vary and split between ideological, political, and social loyalties. The implications of such a diverse and often tribally or socially based conflict is often a generalization of the communities that the warring actors belong to. And what that means is that it can lead to identity-based arrests, detentions, and often torture and ill treatment of those in custody. Amid this, armed actors and armed criminal actors are able to flourish, and they're able to flourish, targeting migrant refugee communities or the Libyan community itself. Libya's conflict, for those of you who are potentially new, kicked off in 2011 when some members of the Libyan community protested the then ruling Gaddafi regime, which had reigned supreme since 1969. Following the 2011 revolt, Libya's revolutionaries, backed by NATO, Qatar, and the UAE, were able to defeat Gaddafi and establish their own government in 2012. At that point, Libya held its first elections. Things were looking good. However, a lack of respect for the results of the ballot, as well as the role of the governing authority, meant that the heavily armed actors who had risen to power following that revolt in 2011 were able to sway decisions in their favor, cause a political and military rift within the quote unquote new Libya, and be it as a result of that, be that as a result of them being unhappy with the legislation being passed by some of the governing authorities, or due to simply divisions amongst the governing authorities themselves, and they would use their new position of power to simply empower themselves against everybody else. What this meant was that you very quickly ended up with a large number of armed actors who had this link to the official governing authority. And what that means is that although that these armed actors were technically able to govern themselves, they were all falling under the auspices of the Ministry of Interior or Ministry of Defense, which really confused things, because it was very difficult to differentiate between formal or informal armed actors. Following these dynamics, armed actors and politicians found themselves divided between two camps by around 2014, one of which by May was led by Khalifa Haftar, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, and others cemented mainly by the city of Misrata. The divide still exists today. Although the shifts between within the sort of two camps that have developed have occurred, especially following 2016 and 17, where both parties kind of really focused their efforts at dismantling Islamic State's presence in the North African nation. The conflict in Libya is really governed by three main dynamics. There's a political dynamic, which is often influenced through external actors. There's an ideological dynamic, which is heavily linked to the political one, but is often used in the majority Muslim country to play along religious narratives, and thus, with the increase of Islamist political actors in the conflict. You'll find sort of this increase of a political Islamic narrative within the both parties of the conflict. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is the social and tribal divide in Libya. Libya's tribal and regional identity nature is at the core of this conflict. So divides between all of these communities can be found and cited in writings decades old, and some of them even dating back centuries. These tribal and social divide lines are what the political factions base their armies on and their political campaigns as well. And so this is where Libya's conflict really begins, and that's where the core of it starts. Now, moving forward more recently, in April 2014, in April 2019, one party of the conflict, so the Libyan Arab Armed Forces led by Khalifa Haftar, launched an offensive on their opposition in Tripoli. This led to a protracted conflict that for 1 year led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people in the Libyan capital, Tripoli. It led to a large amount of destruction, and the implications of that conflict continue now with a very tense stalemate at the moment at the city of Sirte, which is along the coast and in the center between eastern and western Libya, where both parties of the conflict are trying to come together to form some form of political accord in order to avoid further conflict. The implications of the conflict in Libya since 2011 have been extremely heavy on the local population, but also the migrant and refugee population who have been using Libya as a gateway to either migrate to Tunisia and from there to Europe, or to Europe directly. And that's something that's been existent for a very long time in Libya. It predates the conflict, but it's something that certainly flourished, and different smuggling actors were really able to take advantage of the conflict in order to basically in order to really increase the number of people that they were able to smuggle across the Mediterranean at any given time. The detention in Libya as a result of the conflict is also something that increased, be that for migrants and refugees, which I believe is a topic that one of my colleagues will cover a little bit more in detail later on, but also for the Libyan population, because of the fact that we noted that the conflicts in Libya is very tribal. What that means is that all of the different armed actors are formed on a very tribal and social basis, or the majority of them are at least. And so when conflict emerges, or when tensions emerge between different armed actors, they resort to targeting the entire community of that armed actor, as opposed to just individualizing the conflict around those two armed groups. And so what that means is that, if two cities are in conflict and they're neighboring, very quickly you will find both communities detaining and kidnapping their opponents' communities. And this leads to mass detention campaigns in pretty much every conflict that Libya goes through, but also just very small things such as just tensions between the two communities. It doesn't even have to rise to the level of conflict for detentions and kidnappings to occur. Now, during these detentions, because the narrative is so driven by these divisions between these communities, the circumstances of detention can be extremely poor. People are tortured. People are definitely ill-treated, and basic access to basic rights in these detention facilities isn't really existing. And unlike the attention to the migrant population and so on within detention facilities in Libya, the situation of detainees in Libyan detainees in different prisons across Libya is not really discussed as much. Another form of detention that you have is POWs, such as prisoners of war, so fighters from either side of the conflict being detained as a result of the conflict. You also have a lot of arrests and detentions of activists and journalists, people who end up being held simply for spreading a piece of news or for pushing a message that a party of the conflict was not happy with. Another part of detention in Libya also includes children of actors who are considered a threat to national security and so on. So, for example, children of Islamic State fighters, and this can be children at times who are, very, very young babies, basically, being held in prisons alongside Islamic State fighters and their families and so on. Some of them even orphans being held in prisons in different locations in Libya. Releasing these children becomes an extremely complicated issue because a lot of them are born under Islamic State territory or in territory that was at the time controlled by Islamic State, meaning they have no documentation to prove who their parents are. They have no documentation proving where they are from. Some of these children, in most cases where they are held, we're talking about foreign children, and in Libya, a large number of those are Tunisian nationals and so on, but the Tunisian state is often finding itself in a situation where it cannot find enough to sort of recognize these children as being their own, and they end up spending years in jail simply because there is no institution in Libya that is able to take them in. And so the forms of the forms of detention as a result of the conflict in Libya vary quite a lot, and that is often as a result of the type of conflict that is ongoing at that moment in time. What is absolutely certain and what is absolutely concrete throughout all of those is that the implications on be it Libyans or migrants or refugees in the country is often pretty horrendous. And Libya is a country that does not get a lot of media attention. And therefore, as a result of that, that lack of media attention, a lot of this goes very unreported, and it's quite rare that you find Libya in the headlines these days, unlike during the 2011 revolt, where the media was heavily covering the conflict, as well as the 2014 conflict in Libya, where again, there emerged a little bit more media coverage, especially with Islamic State playing a prominent role in the conflict at that time.
Thank you so much, Hassan. Thank you for your presentation. And again, as you just mentioned, the Libya issue is complex. So thank you for sharing. I would like to read one comment from an attendee saying, Libya, currently immigrants are becoming hopeless and giving up waiting for their resettlement process. Instead, thousands of immigrants are taking risky journey to Mediterranean smugglers, and smugglers are taking advantage of resettlement delays, and it's becoming hard to discourage heading to Mediterranean Sea. So thank you so much for that comment, George. So Andrea, do you want to go on with your presentation?
Thank you so much. And I think that transitions very well into what I'm about to talk about. As most of you probably noticed, and from briefly in my introduction, you know that I'm up here today not representing any organization. So you might want to know first a little about my background and why I'm up here today. So for the last year and a half, I've been speaking directly with hundreds of refugees across Libya, documenting their experiences and using this information to conduct advocacy work. Like I said before, I do work at a refugee agency. I've been in the field for almost 7 years and spent a number of years overseas in Israel, mainly working with Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers who survived trafficking and torture in the Sinai Desert a decade ago. The work that I do around Libya, like I said, is completely independent. I don't get any payment for this work. I'm also glad that Hassan talked about the situation of Libyans in the country, because that is very valid and very important to talk about. The reason I'm speaking today about refugees is because that's the community that I know best. However, there are hundreds of thousands of Libyans that have been displaced by the conflict. So before I started working on Libya, I had already been working in refugee-led community centers. And it was normal to get messages from refugees who maybe I didn't know personally. So when a message came up from a Sudanese refugee in Libya, I answered it and I didn't think much of it. He told me that he was in Qasr bin Gashir detention center. This is before it closed last year. And he told me he was afraid for his life. He told me about being tortured and trafficked. He told me about escaping his traffickers and running through dark streets at night, not knowing where to go or where he was, hiding in a shed for a week until the Libyan army found him. He talked about being used as a human shield and about the lack of sanitation and clean water and the lice that was in his hair. We worked together to publish his story on a Times of Israel opinion blog that I had. And after that, I started getting messages from all over the country from refugees saying that they were suffering too. They were in different prisons and they were from different countries, but they all had very similar stories to tell. Then when the war started, things got worse. There was no food, there was no water, there was no protection. Many of them were locked up right on the front lines of the conflict. And then shortly after that started, Qasr bin Gashir, where I knew a lot of people, was attacked. There was a group of Eritrean Christians who were praying for Easter, and a militia came by and told them to stop praying, but they refused. So there was 2 people who were killed immediately, and there were 4 more who passed away in the coming days because they didn't get any medical attention. I made a petition, and that petition got 40,000 signatures. And I connected with Eritrean and Sudanese diaspora groups, and we went to Capitol Hill and talked to lawmakers about the situation, and I grew my network. And that's how I got started in this. I want to talk a little about the detention centers. There's about 27,000 people right now in detention, and there's 11 official detention centers. Most of these people that I know are Eritrean, Sudanese, Ethiopian, and Somali people. But there are also a lot of people from West Africa, especially Mali. There's Syrians, there's people from Bangladesh, there's Palestinians, people from Yemen. There are a lot of people who don't necessarily get talked about as much. They live in big, open concrete warehouses that are referred to as hangars. And there's no beds. It's hundreds of people packed in a big open space, sleeping on foam pads on the ground. There's piles of rotting garbage, and that garbage attracts maggots and lice that get stuck in their bedding. Women and men both face sexual assault. There's no clean water to drink in a lot of the facilities. They have water filters, but they break, and people are forced to drink saline water that gives them ongoing kidney pain. A lot of the people who are in these places were intercepted at sea, and I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But there's also people who were taken to prisons directly from the hands of human traffickers or picked up on the street. I talked a little bit about the situation that happened in Qasr bin Gashir last year, but there were also a few other tragedies that I want to touch on very briefly. There was last year in July an airstrike that hit the Tajura detention center. 53 refugees were killed and 130 were wounded. Those survivors were never evacuated, and many of them have tried to cross the sea. There was a tuberculosis outbreak in Zintan detention center that killed 22 refugees in less than a year. Those people are still in the same prison and haven't been moved. There was a detention center at Al Khoms that was temporarily closed after guards were caught selling inmates to traffickers. I know a Somali refugee whose brother was sold from that prison, and he later found out his brother was killed because his family couldn't pay. That's not just in that center. There's documentation of pretty much all of the detention centers selling refugees, people being stolen out of them. They're forced to work, they're forced to carry heavy machinery, some are even forced to fight. There's also unofficial detention centers, and those are run by traffickers. Refugees are kidnapped, they're given a cell phone, and they're told to call their loved ones. They get tortured as they beg their family over the phone to send the money, as the family members listen. People who are able to pay in dollars because they have families in the West, mainly Eritreans, Ethiopians, are very lucrative, but all people are captured in this way. People who can't pay are sold to other traffickers, sold as slaves, or killed for their organs. I'm getting a little bit graphic here, but I want to illustrate some of the people I know personally who have been going through this. I know an Eritrean man who's being held in an ISIS trafficking cell, who witnessed a guard cut the skin off of a fellow inmate's arm because he had a cross tattoo that offended them. I know a Sudanese man who was forced to dig a grave for his friend who he thought had died. When he was moving the body, he realized he had a faint pulse and just barely saved his friend from being buried alive. I know a man who was forced at gunpoint to defile the corpse of another man who had died. These stories are nightmarish, but these prisons stay open because powerful people get money from them. And because of that, they continue to operate. Outside of the prisons, the situation is slightly better, but not significantly. Like I said, there's about 2,700 refugees in Libyan detention centers. UNHCR has registered almost 50,000 people as asylum seekers in the country. And getting that asylum seeker status is not a track to any sort of protection. There's no functioning refugee system. There's no likelihood that people will get resettled. 50,000 asylum seekers were registered. At the start of this year, there was about 900 resettlement spaces that had been pledged to Libya evacuations. Then the pandemic hit, and so far this year, only 297 people have been evacuated. Out of 50,000 who are recognized as asylum seekers, there's about 600,000 migrants in Libya outside that. So they really only have two options. They can stay in Libya indefinitely, or they can try to cross the sea. People who stay in Libya usually live in Tripoli in clusters. One of the ones that's most well known right now is the Gargaresh area. They face hostility from locals, especially right now because a lot of people think that they carry COVID. There have been refugees killed in their beds by robbers. They live in broken down apartments. Some of these places don't even have dirt. They don't even have floors. They have dirt floors. Some don't have a door. These places are too expensive because landlords know they can take advantage of them. They don't have any legal status. So you'll see as many as a dozen people sleeping in a single one of these bedrooms in the dirt. And there's a constant fear that at any time refugees could be sent back to prison. So because of this, people try to cross the sea. So far this year, 8,000 migrants, more or less, have been intercepted at sea, and almost 400 of them were children. In 2017, Italy, backed by the EU, signed a deal with the Libyan Coast Guard, saying that people would be intercepted and sent back to Libya before reaching international waters. That way, they don't have to call it returns because they never left that search and rescue area. But there are people who get out of the Libyan waters who still are not helped. In the last few months, there's been a number of situations where European coast guards, Italy and Malta especially, sit in a visible distance from a ship in distress and don't intervene. The fuel from the boats mixes with the water as they slowly sink and creates chemical burns on people's bodies, and they call out for help and they aren't helped. People who do help are demonized or criminalized. There's a cargo ship on the Mediterranean right now at this moment called the Etienne. 5 weeks ago, they rescued 27 migrants who were sinking. And for 5 weeks, they've been denied any port to disembark. 27 people. And the entire boat, the entire cargo ship, hasn't been allowed to dock. I want to make it clear it's not just the EU, though. Before this US administration, the average refugee resettlement quota for the United States was around 95,000. That's the average. Some years were more, some years were less. But the average was 95,000 since the 1980 Refugee Act was signed into law. This year, that number is 18,000. And because of the pandemic, we won't even come close to that. Every year since this administration came to office, they've set a new record for the lowest resettlement quota the US has ever had. Last year, the global number of refugees resettled from any country to any country was just over 100,000. 4 years ago, that's almost the number that we were aiming to resettle just in the US, and now that's the worldwide total. So while UNHCR does get a lot of criticism about not doing enough, and some of the criticism is fair, there are a lot of constraints that they're under. There's no place to bring people, and a lot of that stems from the United States. So just before I wrap up, I want to say something about the people I'm speaking to in Libya. I know a lot of them are listening right now. It's easy for people in the West to look at these refugees as vulnerable, helpless, in need of saving. That's what we see in the news every day. You hear people say that They're being a voice for the voiceless, right? I don't know anyone who's voiceless. Their voices are being ignored or actively silenced. So what would you do when your voice is silenced? You grab a microphone and shout louder. The only thing that these refugees had on their body, other than the clothes that were on their backs, was a cell phone. So that became their form of active resistance. I know people in prisons who hide in the bathroom in the middle of the night, sending out messages, telling people what's happening to them. This is dangerous. I know one person who was beaten over the head with a baton when a guard caught him filming another man being beaten. And he woke up 3 days later in the hospital. The next day he was sent back to prison. Despite this risk, they're beaming their message out to the world and taking control of the message, building an advocacy network around the globe. There's dozens of people doing this work that I'm doing. There's journalists, human rights activists, NGO workers, former refugees. This is human beings who are fighting with everything that they have to reclaim the rights and the dignity that they know they deserve. So now that the people on the line have this information and knowledge about what's going on, I hope that you will join this global network and do what you can to help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing those stories. You know, most of them are tough to listen to hear, but those people are living the stories. So I hope that from this type of meetings, we come up with call for action, real action, either on the side of the European Union, the US, and the international community. Really, we need to do something. So from that, I can make a bridge to Phillipe. So Phillipe, do you want to go ahead and make your presentation?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much to my fellow panelists for both giving a good background of the conflict in Libya and where we are at today, as well as the particularly ghastly conditions that refugees are currently living in detention facilities and refugee camps in the country, and the plight of the migrants that have been using Libya to escape other conflicts in other parts of the continent. It's a double whammy of sadness and difficulty that people are enduring, both Libyans and many others from other parts of the world in North Africa right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about the human rights situation and what Amnesty International, which is one of the world's largest human rights organizations in the world, had documented during the conflict in Libya. And then I'll pivot pretty quickly to what's happening here in Washington, D.C. and ways that, as Andrea mentioned, folks can get involved in helping to not just bring about an end to the conflict, but to, at the most basic level, bring the warring parties to the negotiating table, which has in and of itself been very difficult to do up until this point. And we believe that there's some pressure coming from the United States and our European partners and the international community that's actually going to be able to do that. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But first, to the human rights situation. Again, as my panelists have spoken about throughout their presentations, and as many of you have been listening in and reading not just news reports and articles, but summaries from the conflict of the last 6, 7, 8 years, you know that the situation is quite dire on the ground in Libya. In particular, in the last year and a half, things have taken a turn for the worse. We have documented war crimes that have been committed in the country. We've seen detention facilities struck by aircraft. We've seen water treatment facilities, infrastructure that are critical infrastructure that's used to transport food and medicine, and obviously people across the country. So transportation networks, electricity, again, water treatment, waste treatment facilities, they have all been deliberately struck by artillery or airstrikes. So, you know, you hear about the internationalization of the conflict in Libya over the last several years. You now have the internationalization of the human rights abusers. where you have the United Arab Emirates, you have Egyptians, you have Russian mercenaries supported tacitly by the Russian government, all involved in the destruction of Libya and the displacement of tens of thousands of people in Libya and the suffering of Libyans, refugees, and migrants every single day. So when we talk about the conflict in Libya, it is no longer just what's happening to Libyans and what Libyans are doing to each other in this civil conflict, but what other countries, both regional and international actors, are doing to the Libyan people by getting involved and engaging in hostilities. You see Turkish troops and rather Libyan groups supported via weapons from Turkey, and even Syrian mercenaries coming into Libya to fight alongside Turkish-backed groups and the UN-recognized government, engaging in hostilities against other Syrian armed groups that were brought in by Russia and other countries to fight alongside Haftar. So you have this like compounding tragedy of the Syrian conflict being replicated on Libyan soil just because you have regional powers wanting to exert influence over the outcome of the conflict in Libya. Again, at Amnesty, our foremost concern is documenting human rights abuses. So we have taken the evidence that we have been able to find, or our partners in the international humanitarian human rights space have been able to gather from Libya itself, the weapons fragments, to see where these weapons have been manufactured that were dropped on the detention facilities that killed so many people, or on the schools and the hospitals, civilian targets that should have never been targeted by hostile military forces. We've been documenting, collecting this evidence. We even just came out with a report that you all can find if you just Google Amnesty International Libya. We just came out with a report a few weeks ago now, maybe 3 weeks ago, on the protests that have been taking place in the western half of the country, and how there were civilians that were beaten, protest leaders that were abducted by armed groups that were either directly or indirectly affiliated with the UN-backed government and other entities that are on the ground in the chaos in Libya. So we have documented those abuses as well. This is the picture that I'm painting for all of you, so we have a full understanding of what is happening on the ground in terms of human rights. We have multiple countries involved in hostilities in Libya. We have Libyan groups involved, obviously, in hostilities within their own country. And the only people that really are truly affected the most are Libyan civilians who are being displaced and killed. So, pivoting to some of the solutions that we may see on the horizon. Amnesty, along with a multitude of other organizations, have been pushing the United States Congress for several years now to step up to the plate and push the administration, the Donald Trump administration, to take strong, bold action on Libya. Initially, we saw a lot of mixed signals coming from the United States government, where you had Congress, in a sense, coming out against Haftar's human rights abuses and his sort of authoritarian streak that he seems to demonstrate repeatedly, both in his words and in his actions on the ground in Libya. So you've seen the US Congress come out against that individual and his armed forces. And you've seen Donald Trump himself, President Donald Trump, come out in support, maybe lukewarm support, but nevertheless demonstrated an affinity to some regard for General Haftar himself. And so you see mixed signals coming out from the administration, and that has left the international community to sort of deal with Libya on itself. And the international community hasn't done the best job, to be honest, of really getting in there and pushing the different partners to negotiate. And that is mainly because the UN arms embargo is consistently violated. by all of the countries that are involved in the conflict in Libya, so the same countries I've mentioned repeatedly. So there hasn't been much reason to come to the negotiating table because people have been preferring to fight it out on the battlefield instead of talk. However, after all of that, there has been a change, at least here in Washington, where the majority of my work is based, working with the US government and our activists around the country to lobby the US government to improve human rights conditions around the world. There is a bill called the Libya Stabilization Act. It has been introduced in the House of Representatives. It is bipartisan. Ted Deutsch and Congressman Wilson, Democrat and Republican, have introduced this legislation. You have a companion bill in the Senate that is also bipartisan that has been introduced. And we believe that this is the most promising human rights bill we've seen in a long time, and certainly the most promising one on Libya I've ever seen, where a mix of sanctions will be used to help punish those responsible for human rights abuses. I'll caveat that to say that Amnesty does not actually support or endorse sanctions on anyone or any country around the world. That's not a position that we take. However, we saw this bill as so important in terms of its human rights language, and it's pushing people to come to the negotiating table, that we ended up supporting the bill regardless of the sanctions language. However, so you all know what the bill looks like. There is sanctions language in the bill that would punish those responsible for human rights abuses. And there is specific language about how countries that have been interfering in the Libyan conflict, assisting indirectly or indirectly killing Libyans, to seize those operations and to seize the violations of the UN arms embargo and begin a peaceful resolution or dialogue toward a peaceful resolution of the conflict where justice is served. That's sort of the essence of the bill. And, you know, I wanted to take this opportunity just to sort of introduce the people who are here listening in, who may be passionate about bringing about an end to this conflict and feeling helpless in how they can participate in bringing an end to the conflict. Well, you have one of the most promising bipartisan bills we have ever seen on the region and on Libya specifically that we can pass. And we believe that, and I believe that it can pass, frankly, with flying colors in the House and the Senate. And we don't say that very often these days in DC, especially in the midst of an election year. And there's still time to get that done in the next few months before we have a new Congress come in. So, you know, I urge all of you to call your members of Congress. If you are here in the United States, call your member of Congress. It doesn't matter what political party they're affiliated with, and tell them that there is an opportunity for the United States to show leadership and improve the lives of Libyans, African migrants, refugees, and everybody in the region by passing the Libya Stabilization Act, asking your member of Congress to co-sponsor and help pass the Libya Stabilization Act. Call your senators, call your members of Congress, and ask them to get it done. We believe that that's the best hope that we have to push the warring parties to the negotiating table. With that, I will kick it back to the other panelists. I don't know if we're moving to Q&A soon or not, but I'm happy to answer any more questions on the bill or on any of our findings that Amnesty has published on Libya over the last several years.
Thank you so much, Phillipe. This is really great. I've just shared a link for anyone who is interested in working with you, working with us in a follow-up advocacy on Libya, to just click there and put their name in their email. We're going to continue the follow-up, and there's a lot that could be done to you know, on this issue. And I just chatting with another person who is in Italy, Antonietta, who is a medical doctor helping hundreds of refugees from Libya in Italy. She just say that, you know, Italy has recognized that immigrants in Libya have been subjected to torture, Antonietta, can you listen to me? Can you,
Yes,
do you want to share with the team? Okay.
yes, I can. You can hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hello to everyone. Good evening, because here it's 10 o'clock p.m. And well, like Léonce told you, I am a forensic doctor, and I founded the clinic of forensic clinic for asylum seekers, victims of tortures and abuse and other terrible things. Well, I want to share with you one good point for Italy, because like Andrea told us before, there are some critical points about Italy, about memorandum with Libya. We are a memorandum that we signed in 2017 and we reconfirmed in 2019. But in the same year, in 2017, the law introduced a new article in our criminal code, the 613 article, that introduced in our penal code the torture crime. And on 28th of May of this current year, our court in Messina sentenced against three migrants that torture other migrants in Libya. The situation in Libya is very complicated, and I think, and I see every day with my patients that, because they are my patients, that there are particular kind of patients I know, because I tell them that they in this moment have the right to share and to choose for themselves. And I see every day the marks, the things of Libya, of the travel, of everything that they was abused and they was tortured. I think in this moment the court in Sicily, about Palermo court and Messina court, are doing a good work, because I am a consultant, forensic consultant for the Palermo court, and last month I was in Ragusa, that is a city in south of Sicily, where the migrants arrived, and I visit three young men from Bangladesh that travel from Bangladesh to work to Libya, and then in Libya the situation became another of about their dream, and they were tortured. I want to share with you I think about Libya. We have international convention. We know that we have the Geneva Convention, and at Article 33, the Geneva Convention clarified the prohibition of expulsion of people that have the rights to stay in a new state, because their life or freedom will be threatened on account of a race, religion, nationality, and whatever. But I think that there are a big part of people in Africa that left their home country because money maybe is a right to improve our social and economical situation. It's our right. But they left their country because they haven't other choice. And then they arrived in Libya, and Libya became refugees. like Geneva Convention, because when they come in Italy, they can come back to own country, because in our country, they have the possibility to care the new health problem that they have, and that they obtained the new health problem, mental problem like post-traumatic stress disorder or whatever, because they stayed in Libya. And so Libya is a big problem and is a big challenge. And this is my experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonietta, for sharing. That's really strong argument, and thank you for giving us the perspective on the European side. I think it is important that all the international community comes together. Phillipe, if you're still around, there's a question here from Mietek about, with the Libya Stabilization Act.
Yeah, I see it. Yeah, so the question is regarding the Libyan Stabilization Act. How will it ensure that the executive branch puts appropriate pressure on U.S. allies that consistently violate the arms embargo, such as the United Arab Emirates, the UAE? It's a fantastic question from a smart individual. So essentially, the bill is quite specific in that a violation of the arms embargo and human rights violations on the ground will lead to punishment from the United States. Now, we have often seen that punishment from the US government, especially in this administration, but frankly, it's been a problem for a while with previous administrations, where if it's coming from a United States ally of sorts, they're sort of let off the hook and not exactly held accountable. There's a lot of evidence in the fact the United States sells weapons to countries that should not be receiving US arms because of consistent human rights violations. So, in this case, you have the United Arab Emirates that has engaged in sort of an egregious abuses, whether directly or indirectly, in Libya, in addition to a few other countries such as Yemen. And the fact that the US Congress would pass a bill that is specific enough in its language that it will not be tolerated by the United States for these human rights abuses to continue should be enough deterrence for some of these countries to stop engaging in some of this behavior. The problem we've had in the past is because we don't have these kinds of bills that get passed, or they get vetoed when they do get passed by President Trump. And therefore, it sends a message to these allies of the United States that they can continue business as usual. If this bill were to actually get passed and signed, it would send a very strong message to the UAE, whom are quite sensitive to criticism from the United States Congress, to curtail some of the behavior that they've engaged in. And we can only hope that that would be the result should the bill get passed. I think the fact that it's introduced, the fact that it's moving in the US House, meaning it's being supported and voted on in committee, and then it will be put to a big vote in the House of Representatives in its entirety, you are essentially sending a strong signal to the countries that are engaging in human rights abuses in Libya to stop. And that's why it's important that the bill move and that it gets passed.
Thank you so much, Phillipe. Hassan, do you have something to talk about that issue on, you in Tunisia, you are, have information from Libya that, comes every day. I know there are talks in Morocco. Do you think there is hope from those talks so far?
Unfortunately, that's going to be a very pessimistic answer. I don't really think there is much hope from the talks that are happening at the moment, and I think that's really more linked to the fact that the conversation being had is not a serious enough conversation. There aren't enough actors engaged in it in a serious enough manner. I think a lot of what's going on is just buying time. Different actors are trying to ensure that they are able to continue being part of this mess, basically, and just making sure that they're able to continue playing a part in everything that's happening in the country. And that goes for both international and local actors. At the moment, I think actors such as Turkey and a few other international actors, it's in their favor for there not to be conflict ongoing. It's in their favor for there to be dialogue at the moment, because they need to start setting up foundations. They need to start setting up their presence in Libya in a more concrete fashion. In 2019, their entrance, and early 2020, their entrance into the Libyan sphere through conflict in Tripoli was I think only the beginning for a lot of these actors. I think what's absolutely important though to keep in mind is that, and this is extremely important, I think, a message to make to any policymaker or international government that might have a say in what's going on in Libya at the moment, is that war will not be an answer to what's going on in Libya at the moment. And that's not because I'm against war. That's not because of the negative implications of conflict. It's because that's simply the conflict dynamics that Libya is governed by will not allow conflict to be a resolution. Because basically within each and every Libyan community there is a divide. There is a social divide which political factions work to exploit, and work to bring those two different divided actors into their favor. And so automatically those two members of society are, one supports this, the other supports the opposition. And they will switch sides if the person that they're currently with convinces their opposition to join, they'll switch, they'll leave. And so there's always this domino effect when there's a switching of sides. When somebody wins over an actor in Libya, it has a domino effect on everybody else's relationship with the different political actors in Libya. And so what that means is that the conflict the dynamics, the nature of the Libyan dynamics will not allow conflict to be the way forward. In fact, conflict really only reinforces those divisions. It empowers both political factions and results in no real victory, because ultimately you end up right back where you started. And you end up in this cycle of conflict in Libya, and we see the exact same thing happening over and over and over again. The intensity level, the exact way that it happens changes, but in general, the conflict is something that is extremely repetitive. What's happening right at this moment in Libya is not something new. It's not something we haven't seen before. A lot of the divisions, again, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, a lot of the tribal dynamics that govern the conflict at the moment, that are right at the root cause of the conflict, have existed for centuries. These are the exact same divisions that existed in the early 1900s and so on, and that have existed throughout since then. And it's extremely interesting when you look at old books about Libya and tribal anthropologists who researched Libya in 1903 and 1911 and so on. The conflict have existed for centuries. And you find that basically what they wrote all the way back then is still happening right now. Those dynamics still exist. I think if we approach Libya from a perspective of somebody backing somebody for conflict, we're not going to get anywhere. I think we really need to work towards ensuring that at a local level, and then also, at the same time at a national level, we're working towards some level of accord. The fact that the Libyan tribes, and therefore the Libyan society, and the majority of actors involved in Libya are not necessarily politically aligned. They're not necessarily ideologically aligned. I think that's an opportunity. I think that's part of the problem, but it's also an opportunity, because what it means is that really the only issue we have is decent governance. And really, once we resolve that governance issue, once we resolve the way, regardless of who's in charge, everybody has equal access to services and equal access to opportunity, and so on. Once we fix how that works, there isn't a specific policy that Libyans divide across. What they want their country to be, what kind of foreign policy, internal policies that Libya want. When you get into that debate with Libyans, it's not very different. They want the same things. The people in the country want the same things. They just don't trust that their social foes will allow them that level of access to services and so on. And so therefore they feel that unless they are in charge, they will not have that access. And it's that trust issue. It's that lack of system to govern that I think allows a lot of that space in which all of these different criminal, political, ideological, and other international as well actors are able to take advantage and really flourish.
Thank you so much, Hassan, for your insight on that. Before we finish, I just want to remind people about the link that I shared if you want to be part of this advocacy work. Also, we have George on, who is one of the attendees who runs a shelter in Libya. He's saying that, what those people are going through is really, really hard. He mentioned human trafficking, and I wanted to call up Michael, who knows a lot about human trafficking happening in that region. Michael, do you want to, maybe in 1 minute share about what people are going through regarding human trafficking?
Sure. Thank you, Léonce, and thank you all the panelists, and also those who are working on the ground and sharing their experience and expertise on this field. I am really happy to see that happening. I am sure a lot of my colleagues like George, who are working also on the ground like me, are also in the panel. Personally, I was also, I know in the first hand about traffickers and also their treatment, because in the end of 2007 and in the beginning of 2008, I was smuggled from Sudan to Israel. I know in the first hand, and I lost a lot of dear friends in Sahara and also in Mediterranean Sea. Even still now, I am in contact with a lot of detainees in Libya. Sometimes it's very hard for me even like to answer their calls. Even sometimes it's very hard for me to see their pictures. Even though I know 100% what's happening in their life, it's very hard for me. Especially right now, they are calling for emergency, especially for resettlement. If the international human rights organizations, especially resettlement agencies, UNHCR and the other bodies, they are not hurry to relocate these people, we will see a lot of horror of loss of humanity in Libya, because I meet them daily and I see their hurt, and they are gave up in life. As George mentioned, he was right. A lot of people, even when you talk to them, please don't push yourself to go to Mediterranean. It is risky for your life. Nobody will even want to listen. So I don't want to see this horror as we saw for years, the international community to intervene and also to resettle these people, and also to assess and help to those organizations working on the ground. I'm really sorry to see also the suffering of Libyans in the ground, because I am a refugee. I can only represent refugees, but I really aware and also sad for the life of Libyans also on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's a really strong testimony. Again, a lot is happening, and David just said many countries are involved. Turkey, Russia, China not doing anything with UN resolutions, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. So it's complicated, but wherever you are, please take some action. Phillipe has shared what we can do for those who are in the US. I'm sure there's some action that can be done in Europe as well, as Antonietta shared. Italy is making steps. So this is an ongoing struggle. Let's work together to do something about it. I share the link to put your name and your contact if you're interested in being a part of this advocacy. And I want to thank everyone. Thank you so much for the panelists. Phillipe, Andrea, Hassan, and Michael, and everyone who helped putting together this panel. Thank you for the attendees, and let's hope we continue this conversation in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.